In my document, I've fixed things up a little bit to use my block items correctly. So I now have a div called overview container that contains all of the content in my overview. I might use that later in the course in terms of styling or scripting. Maybe I want to make that section collapsible through some script. So I've identified the whole section, which will allow me to treat it as one element and collapse the whole thing visually. I have my paragraph here and my objective headers. And then I've also got a new div down here that I'm going to use for some examples. So let's look at the white space. Let's take our paragraph from up top here. And we'll put this down in an example. Let's go in here and we'll put an H2. We'll call it examples. And now in here, we'll come in and this will be H3. So our example is white space. I want to call out that particular part of the document. So you'll notice all of this paragraph is on one line. But what happens if I do this? If after every sentence or section here, I put some carriage returns in the source and save it, when we come down and look at the rendered content, you'll notice it's still all rendered as a paragraph. Those carriage returns are completely ignored by the browser, and it's really rendering based on these elements. It sees that this is a paragraph. It's going to take all the content within there and render it as a paragraph unless it sees some other HTML element that instructs it to do something differently. So even if I put a ton of spaces between these browser names, you'll notice, again, I get a single space. So the white space is considered something that is not going to be preserved in these cases. Now, let's go down a step further and let's take an example for this where we actually want to have some content that is pre-formatted. So I want to put in here some content that I want the browser to display. I don't want it to display it a particular way. So I'm going to stick a little haiku in here. See if I can remember my haiku. And notice that I have spacing here so that the first and last lines are indented and the second one is not. And you'll notice that when we do the pre, that information in the browser normally gets rendered with this particular typeface, and it now does respect that white space. So if I put a bunch of spaces in here, those get rendered out now as visible white space within the document. So if you want the white space to show up, if you care about that, use the pre element in order to handle that for you. So we've got that. Now let's go in and look. If I do a span, we do another one here. Oops. We know that these are inline elements, and so if we look at them, they should appear right next to each other. They're inline elements. Even if I go in and put those on a second line, they're still going to show up. I do now, the carriage return does end up adding a space in there in this particular browser. But I have now all this information. Now, I want to add some breaks. I'm going to add some breaks because I want to actually have some white space at the bottom of this document. So every time I refresh it, it's not at the bottom of the page. But what if I actually don't want those on the same line? I can use the break for that. I put a line break in, I save, I refresh, and now we're going to see an actual line break in the document. So even though these are two inline elements, they would normally render on the same line, we can tell the browser, tell the client, please add a line break here at this particular point. Now, what if I want to separate these examples? Well, that's where the horizontal rule comes in. Or I could put that in and refresh, and you'll notice now I have a nice line above this first span, second span. I could do the same thing here between my white space items here and get that line to separate those items out. So again, kind of old school, but you could style that or make it appear different ways or use images to get the same effect. Finally, I want to use some character references. So let me go back in here. We'll follow our pattern here. and I want to identify now some content. I want to say maybe div. This is how you write a div. And what I want is actually to show this content in the page. I actually want you to see the div element here. And so let's do it like this. I want to do div. Well, you can already tell from the syntax highlighting in here that the client is going to expect it to be a div, and it doesn't show up. So I need to come in and use my character references. And now those items actually get rendered out. I can actually see the less than and greater than sign around the element. The browser knows that I want to render these character entities, not that I want to actually use a div within the markup. And finally, we'll look at the non-breaking space. So if we look at this paragraph, notice that it shows up in my browser. And as I shrink this, if you watch, as the words get close to the right-hand side, they begin to wrap and go around to the other side. So let's say I don't want it to break in some particular spot. So maybe I don't want it to break between this and course. So I'm going to put a non-breaking space in there. We'll refresh this. So now as we go, you'll see each word, as I expand, goes off the page. But notice here, course doesn't go off the page. This end course goes off and on to the next line. So that non-breaking space tells the browser, do not break at this particular point. You could break at any other logical point, all right, left or right of this in the stream of text, but do not break at this particular point.